The hallway smelled like bleach and old carpet, the kind of clean that never quite erased what had been there before. Frank Calder pushed his mop bucket slowly, careful not to let the wheels squeak. He hated noise at night. Sound traveled farther after midnight like it had nowhere else to go. It was just after 1 in the morning. The building was mostly asleep. Frank had worked nights for so long that darkness felt normal to him. The daytime world felt loud and sharp, full of people in a hurry. Nights were softer. Nights gave you space to think, even when you didn't want to. He stopped near the east stairwell and leaned on the mop handle for a moment. His knees ached. They always did when the weather changed. The forecast had said rain, and his joints believed it before the sky did. Frank was 56 years old. He had been a janitor for most of his adult life, not because he dreamed of it, but because it was steady. Because buildings always needed cleaning, and somebody always had to work when everyone else went home. This building was a downtown office tower, 12 stories of law firms, insurance companies, and a small investment group on the top floor. During the day, men in pressed shirts and women with coffee cups hurried through the lobby without ever really seeing him. At night, it belonged to Frank. The lights were dimmed, the elevators quiet. The security desk was empty until 2, when the guard would come back from his break. Frank moved again, pushing the bucket toward the far end of the hall. That's when he saw the shape on the floor. At first, he thought it was a pile of coats. Sometimes, people left things behind, umbrellas, boxes, once even a violin in a soft black case. But this shape shifted slightly. A shoulder rose and fell. Frank stopped. He stood there longer than he meant to, listening. The building hummed softly around him, air moving through vents, electricity whispering behind the walls, and underneath it all, the faint sound of breathing. A man was lying against the wall, curled on his side. He wore a dark jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and his shoes were scuffed, nearly smooth. A knit cap covered his head, pulled down low. Frank's first instinct was fear, not panic, just a tightening in the chest. You didn't expect people down here at this hour, not like this. His second instinct was irritation. Security was supposed to keep this from happening. If someone found out, it would be Frank who got questions first. He cleared his throat softly. The man didn't move. Frank nudged the mop bucket closer, the wheels rolling an inch before he stopped them again. He lowered himself slowly, joints protesting, until he was crouched a few feet away. "Hey," he said quietly. No response. The man's face was partly turned toward the wall. Frank could see gray stubble along his jaw, deep lines etched around his mouth. He looked older than Frank at first glance, but then Frank realized it was the wear, not the years. Frank straightened up again. He could call security. That was the rule. He knew it by heart. No unauthorized persons in the building after hours. He looked down the hallway. Empty. Still. Frank had grown up with rules. His father loved rules. Rules made sense, his father used to say. Follow them. And life stayed simple. But life hadn't stayed simple. Frank thought of his own apartment, small and quiet, with the radiator that knocked all winter and the kitchen light that flickered if you didn't screw the bulb in just right. He thought of the nights he came home bone-tired, sat on the edge of the bed, and didn't turn the TV on because silence felt heavier somehow. He looked back at the man on the floor. "How'd you even get in here?" Frank muttered, not expecting an answer. The man shifted slightly, a low sound escaping his throat. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself. Frank noticed his hands then, red, cracked, nails rimmed with dirt that never quite came off. Cold, Frank thought. It had dropped below freezing that night. Frank stood there, torn between the weight of habit and something quieter tugging at him. He remembered a winter years ago when his car had broken down, and he'd spent 4 hours waiting for a tow, the cold creeping into his bones until he thought it might stay there forever. He remembered how the gas station clerk had let him stand inside, no questions asked, handed him a cup of coffee like it was nothing. That cup had meant more than the coffee. Frank sighed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, checking the time again. 1:15. Security wouldn't be back for another 45 minutes. He looked at the man, then at the empty hallway. "All right," Frank said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Just for a bit." He walked back to his cart and grabbed a folded spare blanket he kept for emergencies. Mostly for himself, when the night air conditioning got too aggressive. He returned and draped it gently over the man's shoulders. The man stirred, eyes fluttering open. They were a pale blue, cloudy with sleep and something else Frank recognized too well. Wariness. "Easy," Frank said. "You're all right." The man blinked, then pulled himself up a little, back against the wall. He looked around, taking in the hallway, the mop bucket, Frank's uniform. "I'm not causing trouble," the man said quickly. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. "I know," Frank said. "Just try to rest. Security'll be back soon. You can stay till then." The man studied him, like he was trying to decide whether this kindness came with a catch. "Name's Walter," the man said after a moment. "Frank," Frank replied. Walter nodded once, then let his head rest back against the wall. His eyes closed again, not fully trusting sleep, but drifting toward it. Frank returned to his work slower now. Every few minutes he glanced down the hall to make sure Walter was still there, still breathing. The building felt different with another person inside it, less empty, more fragile somehow. Frank finished mopping the floor near the elevators and parked his cart by the janitor's closet. He leaned against the wall and rubbed his knees. He didn't know why he felt uneasy. He had done a small thing, a human thing. Still, a quiet tension sat in his chest, like the air before a storm. Somewhere far away, a siren wailed, then faded. Frank watched the hallway, the sleeping man wrapped in a thin blanket, and wondered, not for the first time that night, how one small decision could change the shape of a morning. Frank didn't sleep much after that, even though his shift ended at 4. When he got home, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and stared out the window at the dark street below. A delivery truck rumbled past. Somewhere, a neighbor's radio played low through a wall. He kept seeing Walter's face, the way his eyes had snapped, open, sharp and tired at the same time, the way he'd said his name like it was something he didn't use often anymore. Frank finally lay down on his bed without taking his clothes off. He closed his eyes and listened to the radiator knock and hiss. Sleep came in short pieces, broken and thin. By the time his alarm went off at 9, Frank felt like he'd barely been under. He showered, shaved carefully, and put on the same uniform he wore every weekday. The routine steadied him. Buttons, belt, shoes. He checked his reflection once, adjusted his collar, and headed out. Downtown was already alive when he arrived. People streamed into the building, coffee cups in hand, eyes on their phones. Frank nodded at a few familiar faces. Most didn't notice him. The lobby smelled like fresh polish and perfume. At the security desk, a young guard named Miguel sat scrolling on his phone. He looked up and smiled. "Morning, Frank." "Morning," Frank said. His voice sounded normal, which surprised him. He pushed his cart toward the service elevator, heart beating a little faster than usual. He told himself there was nothing to worry about. Walter would have left by now. That was the understanding. Still, when the doors opened on the 3rd floor, Frank felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The hallway was empty. No blanket. No man against the wall. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He went about his work, wiping down railings, emptying trash bins. The building settled into its daytime rhythm around him. It should have ended there. Around 10:30, Frank was in the supply closet when he heard voices, sharp, urgent, nothing like the usual murmur of office chatter. He stepped into the hallway and froze. 2 men in dark suits were walking toward him. They moved with purpose, eyes scanning doors, corners, people. One of them spoke quietly into an earpiece. Behind them, more men followed. Black SUVs were visible through the windows at the end of the hall, parked tight against the curb outside. Frank's mouth went dry. The men stopped in front of him. "Sir," the taller one said, flashing a badge so quickly Frank barely registered it. "We need to ask you a few questions." Frank nodded, throat tight. "About what?" "About last night," the man said. "Did you see anyone unusual in the building?" Frank's mind raced. He could hear his father's voice in his head. "Follow the rules. Don't get involved." But he saw Walter again, curled on the floor, hands cracked from the cold. "I saw a man," Frank said carefully. "Late, sleeping in the hallway." The 2 men exchanged a glance. "Did you speak with him?" The shorter one asked. "Yes." "Did you give him anything?" Frank hesitated, then nodded. "A blanket." The taller man studied Frank's face, like he was trying to read something written between the lines. "Do you know his name?" "Walter," Frank said. "That's what he told me. The airship." "Ted." It was subtle, but Frank felt it. "Can you describe him?" the man asked. Frank did. The jacket, the cap, the eyes. The men listened without interrupting. When did you last see him? The shorter one asked. Early morning. He was gone by 9. Another pause. Sir, the taller man said, his voice softer now, do you understand who you spoke to last night? Frank shook his head. No. The man exhaled slowly. Walter Hale. The name meant nothing to Frank. He's been missing for almost a year, the man continued. Former CEO of Hale Systems. Frank blinked. The tech company? The man nodded. Frank felt the hallway tilt slightly. He steadied himself against his cart. He disappeared after a federal investigation began, the man said. We've been trying to locate him ever since. Frank thought of Walter's hands, his tired eyes, the way he'd pulled the blanket close like it might disappear. You're saying, Frank started, that the man you helped last night, the agent said, is the reason these SUVs are outside. Frank swallowed. Am I in trouble? No, the man said quickly. You did nothing wrong. Frank wasn't sure he believed that. Did he say anything else? The agent asked. Anything at all? Frank searched his memory. Walter's voice had been quiet, careful. He said he wasn't causing trouble, Frank said. That's about it. The agent nodded, making a note. We may need to review security footage, he said, and we might have more questions. Frank nodded again. As the men moved past him, the building felt suddenly too small, like it was holding its breath. Frank finished his shift in a fog. He barely noticed the hours passing. His hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over. On his way out, he paused by the east stairwell. He imagined the empty space where Walter had slept. He wondered where Walter was now, if he was safe, if he was warm, and he wondered, for the first time, whether letting a man sleep on a hallway floor had been an act of kindness, or the beginning of something far larger than he'd ever intended. The questions didn't stop after that day. They came gently at first, then with more weight. Frank was called into a small conference room on the second floor that afternoon. The blinds were half closed, letting in thin strips of light. 2 agents sat across from him, different ones this time, both polite, both careful. They asked him to walk through the night again, minute by minute. What time he'd started his shift, where he'd been cleaning, exactly when he'd seen Walter. Frank answered as best he could. He focused on details, times, locations, the sound of the building. It grounded him. What did he seem like? One of them asked. Frank thought for a moment. Tired, he said. Not dangerous, just worn down. The agent nodded slowly. Did he mention why he was there? The other asked. No. Did he ask for help? Frank hesitated. No. I offered. The agents exchanged another look, one Frank was starting to recognize. After that, Frank went home and sat in his quiet apartment, the day pressing down on him like a weight. He turned the TV on but didn't really watch it. His phone stayed silent. That night, he dreamed of hallways that never ended, doors that wouldn't open, a blanket slipping from his hands. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Frank was through cleaning the lobby when a woman approached him. She was in her late 40s, hair pulled back neatly, eyes sharp but tired. Frank Calder? She asked. Yes, Frank said, straightening. I'm Susan Hale, she said. Walter's sister. Frank's breath caught. She studied his face, then offered a small, tight smile. May we talk? They sat on a bench, near the windows, sunlight spilling across the floor between them. Susan folded her hands in her lap, fingers twisting slightly. I wanted to thank you, she said, for treating my brother like a human being. Frank didn't know what to say. He stared at his hands. He's been found, Susan continued, alive, cold, stubborn as ever. Relief washed through Frank so fast it made his eyes sting. He didn't want to be found, she said quietly. He thought disappearing was easier than facing what he'd done, or what people thought he'd done. Frank nodded. He understood that urge more than he wanted to admit. He told them about you, Susan said, about the blanket, about you not asking questions. Frank looked up. He talked about me. Susan smiled again, this time softer. Yes. They sat in silence for a moment, the building humming around them. He'll have to answer for his choices, Susan said. But you gave him one night of dignity. That matters. After she left, Frank returned to his cart. The mop felt heavier in his hands, but his steps felt steadier. That night, as he locked his apartment door, Frank paused. He looked around his small space, the worn couch, the flickering light, the quiet. He realized something then, that the smallest acts, the ones that barely register at the time, sometimes echo far beyond the hallway where they begin. Life didn't change all at once. It shifted slowly, like a chair being moved across a room without anyone noticing until it was somewhere else. The black SUVs disappeared. The agents stopped coming by. The building returned to its usual rhythm. But Frank found himself noticing things more. He noticed the way people avoided eye contact when someone on the street asked for change. He noticed how easy it was to look away. Some nights he brought an extra sandwich to work, just in case. He never said why. Weeks passed. Then months. One evening, as Frank finished his shift, he found an envelope tucked into his locker. His name was written on it in careful handwriting. Inside was a short note. "Frank, Walter wanted you to have this. No pressure, just gratitude. Susan." There was a business card inside. Walter Hale's name was printed on it, along with a phone number. Frank sat on the locker room bench for a long time, card in his hand. He didn't know if he would ever call. He didn't know what he would say, but it felt good to know the option existed. Outside, the city lights flickered on as dusk settled in. Frank stepped into the evening air, the chill biting his cheeks. He pulled his jacket tighter and started the walk home, his footsteps steady on the sidewalk. Frank never did call Walter, not because he didn't care, but because some connections didn't need words to stay real. Instead, he kept doing what he'd always done, showing up, cleaning floors, working quietly in the background of other people's lives. But something had changed in him. A softness had settled where caution used to live alone. One winter night, nearly a year later, Frank found another man sleeping near the loading dock. This time, he didn't hesitate. He brought a blanket and a cup of coffee. The man looked up, surprised, eyes shining in the dim light. "Thank you," the man said. Frank nodded. "Stay warm." As Frank walked away, the building felt less empty, and for the first time in a long while, so did he. Some stories don't end with applause or answers. They end with quiet understanding. Frank never saw black SUVs again. Walter faded back into his own complicated life. The hallway stayed just a hallway. But in that space, between rules and kindness, between fear and choice, something human had passed from one person to another. And sometimes that's enough, because long after the floors are cleaned and the lights are turned off, what remains isn't what we were supposed to do. It's what we chose to do when no one was watching.